What happens when a late-night host crosses the line with one of Hollywood's most legendary tough guys? When Stephen Colbert decided to take aim at Clint Eastwood during a charity event in Los Angeles, nobody expected the verbal showdown that would follow. The annual Hollywood Veterans Benefit Gala was meant to be a night of unity and support. The grand ballroom of the Beverly Hills Hotel sparkled with celebrities, industry executives, and military veterans. Red, white, and blue decorations hung tastefully from the ceiling, and round tables draped in white linen filled the room. A stage stood at the front, adorned with a podium bearing the seal of the Veterans Association. Stephen Colbert, the evening's surprise host, had been drinking. Not enough to slur his words, but enough to loosen his inhibitions. He had never been a fan of Clint Eastwood's politics, and tonight, with liquid courage coursing through his veins, he decided to make his feelings known. Colbert took to the stage after dinner, microphone in hand. The audience quieted down, expecting the usual comedic routine. What they got instead shocked everyone. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen," Colbert began, his voice carrying across the silent room. "It's an honor to host this fantastic event supporting our veterans. You know, speaking of old things that should probably be retired," he pointed directly at Clint Eastwood, sitting at a front table. "We have the man himself here tonight. Clint Eastwood, everybody." A smattering of applause broke out, though confusion was evident on many faces. Eastwood nodded curtly, his jaw visibly tightening. "You know, Clint has been making movies longer than some of you have been alive," Colbert continued. "Dirty Harry, Gran Torino, that time he yelled at an empty chair pretending it was Obama." The audience shifted uncomfortably. "Tell me, Clint, do you still talk to furniture when the cameras aren't rolling?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Eastwood's steely gaze locked onto Colbert, his weathered face betraying no emotion. "What's the matter, Clint?" Colbert pressed, on ignoring the warning looks from the event organizers. "Cat got your tongue? Or do you only speak when there's an invisible president around?" Eastwood slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. At 94 years old, he still commanded a room with his presence. His voice, when it came, was low and gravelly. "You know, son," he said, barely audible yet somehow filling the entire ballroom, "I've been in this business long enough to know when someone's using shock value to cover for a lack of actual talent." Colbert's smile faltered. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. "Is that right?" Colbert shot back. "Because I've been in this business long enough to recognize when someone's past their prime, but refuses to recognize it." The audience gasped. Several veterans at nearby tables stood up, clearly unhappy with the disrespect being shown. "You think you're being brave, taking shots at me?" Eastwood asked, his voice never rising above that menacing whisper. "Try making 5 films after you turn 90, then talk to me about being past your prime." "5 films nobody watched," Colbert retorted, gripping the microphone tighter. "Look, I respect what you've done for cinema, but let's not pretend your political views aren't from the Stone Age." Eastwood began walking toward the stage with deliberate slowness. The room was so quiet you could hear his footsteps on the carpet. "This event is about veterans," Eastwood said. "Men and women who sacrificed everything for your freedom to stand up there and make a fool of yourself. And you're using it as an opportunity to score cheap political points?" Colbert's producer was frantically waving at him from the side of the stage, signaling him to move on, but Colbert was too far gone. "Don't lecture me about respect when you've spent years supporting policies that hurt the very people we're here to help tonight," Colbert said, his voice rising. "At least I don't hide behind some tough guy persona while pushing an agenda that—" "Fuck off, Clint," Colbert suddenly snapped, his patience evaporating. "You don't get to play the hero card here, not tonight." The audience erupted in shocked murmurs. Eastwood paused at the steps leading to the stage, his hand gripping the railing. For a moment, it seemed like the 94-year-old might actually climb up and confront Colbert physically. Instead, he spoke with quiet intensity. "Son, I've played heroes on screen, but the real heroes are sitting in this room tonight, and you've just disrespected every single one of them with your childish behavior." Several veterans stood and applauded. Colbert looked around, suddenly aware that he had lost the room completely. What had started as an attempt to score points against a political opponent had turned into a public relations nightmare. A military officer in full-dress uniform approached Eastwood and whispered something in his ear. Eastwood nodded and allowed himself to be escorted back to his table, but his eyes never left Colbert's face. Colbert cleared his throat, attempting to regain control. "Well, looks like someone can't take a joke. Let's move on to the actual fundraising portion of the evening, shall we?" But the damage was done. The tension in the room was palpable, and everyone knew this night was far from over. The fundraising portion of the evening proceeded with excruciating awkwardness. Colbert stumbled through his talking points, his usual sharp comedic timing dulled by the hostility emanating from the audience. His jokes fell flat, met with stony silence rather than laughter. Every few seconds, his eyes would dart to Eastwood's table, where the legendary actor sat motionless, those famous pale blue eyes never leaving Colbert's face. A young event coordinator eventually took over the microphone, guiding the audience through the donation process while Colbert retreated to the side of the stage. The moment the formal program concluded, Colbert made a beeline for the exit, but was intercepted by the event's organizer, Senator James Wilson. "What the hell was that?" Wilson hissed, gripping Colbert's elbow and steering him toward a quiet corner of the ballroom. "You were brought here to bring some levity to the evening, not to create a spectacle." "He's been taking pot shots at my politics for years," Colbert said defensively. "I just gave him a taste of his own medicine." "This isn't about politics," Wilson said. "This is about respect. That man is a veteran supporter who's raised millions for the causes we're celebrating tonight. And you decided to turn this into some personal vendetta? Fix this, Colbert. Now." With that, Wilson strode away, leaving Colbert alone with his thoughts. Across the room, a small crowd had gathered around Eastwood's table, offering words of support. The contrast wasn't lost on Colbert. Eastwood surrounded by admirers while he stood isolated, the pariah of the evening. Swallowing his pride, Colbert began making his way toward Eastwood's table. The crowd parted silently, disapproving eyes following his progress. When he reached Eastwood, the older man didn't even look up. "Mr. Eastwood," Colbert began, his voice much softer than before, "I think we got off on the wrong foot." Eastwood slowly raised his gaze. "Wrong foot? Is that what you call publicly disrespecting someone at a charity event?" "Look, I may have had a few too many drinks and things got out of hand," Colbert admitted. "For what it's worth, I apologize." "Save your apologies," Eastwood replied. "I'm not the one you insulted. These veterans deserved better than your petty political grandstanding." A tall man in a marine dress uniform standing nearby nodded in agreement. "We didn't come here for a partisan brawl, Mr. Colbert." Colbert felt his temper rising again. The apology had cost him, and it wasn't being accepted. "I said I was sorry. What more do you want?" "Nothing from you," Eastwood said dismissively. "In fact, I think everyone here would appreciate it if you left." Something in Colbert snapped. The public rejection, the humiliation, it was too much. "You know what? I take it back. All of it. You are exactly the arrogant, self-righteous fossil I said you were." Eastwood stood up slowly, towering over the seated guests. "Son, you're making a mistake." "No. The mistake was thinking someone like you deserved my respect," Colbert retorted, his voice rising again. "You stand there on your pedestal, judging everyone else, but what have you actually done? Made movies where you talk tough and shoot people?" The crowd around them grew, sensing another confrontation brewing. Phones were discreetly raised, capturing the moment. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Eastwood said, his voice dangerously quiet. "I've lived through more hardship than you can imagine. I grew up during the Depression. I served in the military during the Korean War. I worked as a lumberjack and a swimming instructor just to make ends meet before I ever stood in front of a camera. And yet here you are, a millionaire many times over, supporting policies that would keep others from achieving what you did, Colbert countered. How convenient. Eastwood's eyes narrowed. You think you know me based on sound bites and political affiliations? You don't know the first thing about me, son. I know enough, Colbert said. I know you're part of the problem in this country. You and your tough guy act. Without warning, Eastwood reached into his jacket pocket. For a bizarre moment, Colbert wondered if the man who had played Dirty Harry for so many years actually carried a real gun. Instead, Eastwood pulled out a small leather wallet and flipped it open, revealing an old, faded photograph. "This is my father," Eastwood said, his voice steady. "He worked 15 hours a day during the Depression to keep food on our table. Never complained, never asked for handouts. Taught me the value of hard work and self-reliance. That's not a political stance. That's a life philosophy." "Well, times have changed," Colbert replied, though with slightly less conviction. "Not everyone has the same opportunities." "You think I don't know that?" Eastwood asked incredulously. "You think because I believe in personal responsibility that I don't want to help others? Why do you think I'm here tonight?" Before Colbert could respond, a commotion near the entrance diverted everyone's attention. A group of paparazzi had somehow gotten past security and were now swarming into the ballroom, cameras flashing. "There they are!" one photographer shouted, pointing toward Colbert and Eastwood. "Get the shot!" The flash of cameras created a momentary chaos. Security personnel rushed to intercept the intruders, but not before several photographers had captured the confrontation. Colbert instinctively raised a hand to shield his face, while Eastwood remained impassive, seemingly unbothered by the intrusion. When the security team had finally escorted the paparazzi out, Eastwood turned back to Colbert. "Looks like your little tantrum is going to make tomorrow's headlines." "This isn't just on me," Colbert protested. "You played your part too. The difference is, I don't care what they print about me," Eastwood replied. "Never have. But your whole career is built on public perception, isn't it?" Colbert felt the blood drain from his face. Eastwood was right. This kind of publicity could be devastating for his show, his reputation. "We're not done here," Colbert said, his voice now barely above a whisper. "This conversation isn't over." "It never is with your type," Eastwood said with a mirthless smile. "Always need to have the last word." As Colbert turned to leave, he felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He turned to find himself face to face with General Robert Harris, a decorated veteran and the guest of honor for the evening. "Mr. Colbert, Mr. Eastwood," Harris said firmly, "I think it's time we took this somewhere private. This event is about helping veterans, not creating tabloid fodder. Follow me, gentlemen." Without waiting for a response, the general turned and headed toward a side door marked "Staff Only." Eastwood, after a moment's hesitation, followed. Colbert, seeing no graceful way out, reluctantly trailed behind, aware of hundreds of eyes watching their every move. The staff-only door led to a small conference room. Unlike the opulent ballroom, this space was utilitarian. A rectangular table surrounded by office chairs, harsh fluorescent lighting, and walls adorned only with a single framed photograph of the hotel's founder. General Harris closed the door behind them with a decisive click. "Sit," he commanded, not as a suggestion, but as an order from a man accustomed to being obeyed. Both men complied, taking seats at opposite ends of the table. General Harris remained standing, his decorated uniform adding to his air of authority. "Gentlemen, I've commanded troops in 3 combat zones, negotiated with tribal warlords, and brokered peace between lifelong enemies," the general began, pacing slowly. "And yet what I witnessed out there was one of the most disappointing displays of adult behavior I've ever seen." Colbert opened his mouth to speak, but the general held up a silencing hand. "I'm not finished, Mr. Colbert. This event raises crucial funds for veterans suffering from PTSD, homelessness, and injuries sustained in service to this country. Veterans who would give anything to have the platform and influence you both possess. And you've turned it into a schoolyard spat." "With all due respect, General," Eastwood interjected, his gravelly voice subdued, "I was simply responding to unprovoked attacks." "And that's your excuse, Mr. Eastwood?" Harris challenged. "A man who's portrayed resilience and strength on screen for decades can't handle a few barbed comments without escalating the situation?" Eastwood's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. "As for you, Mr. Colbert," the general continued, turning, his piercing gaze to the talk show host, "your behavior was not only unprofessional but deeply disrespectful to every person in that room who has served." "I meant no disrespect to the veterans," Colbert insisted. "My issue is with him and the harmful policies he supports." "Harmful?" Eastwood's voice rose for the first time. "You live in such a bubble that you can't fathom anyone disagreeing with your worldview without being evil, can you?" "This isn't about different opinions," Colbert fired back. "It's about right and wrong, about compassion versus callousness." "And you think you have a monopoly on compassion?" Eastwood leaned forward, eyes blazing. "You think because I believe in self-reliance that I don't care about people who are struggling?" "Your voting record speaks for itself," Colbert retorted. "Enough!" General Harris slammed his palm down on the table with such force that both men flinched. "This is exactly what's tearing our country apart. This inability to see beyond political tribes." A heavy silence fell over the room. Outside, the muffled sounds of the gala continued. Clinking glasses, distant laughter, the soft strains of a jazz band. In here, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. "Now," the general said, his voice calmer but no less commanding, "you're both going to listen, and then you're going to find a way to salvage this evening. Not for yourselves, but for the men and women who deserve better." He pulled out his phone and showed them something. A Twitter feed already lighting up with blurry photos and videos of their confrontation. "The damage is done," Harris continued. "By morning, this will be everywhere. The question is whether the story ends with two respected public figures behaving like children, or with something more meaningful." Colbert slumped in his chair, the reality of the situation sinking in. His producer would be having a meltdown right now. The network executives would be calling emergency meetings, all because he couldn't control his temper, or his drinking. Eastwood, for his part, sat perfectly still, his weathered face unreadable. Only the slight tapping of his index finger on the table betrayed any emotion. "I suggest you start by actually talking to each other," Harris said. "Not shouting, not performing for an audience. Just talking. I'll give you 10 minutes, and then I expect both of you back in that ballroom ready to make amends." With that, he strode to the door. "Don't make me come back in here, gentlemen." The door closed behind him, leaving Colbert and Eastwood alone in the sterile conference room. For nearly a full minute, neither spoke. The hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening in the silence. "You really think I'm some kind of monster, don't you?" Eastwood finally asked, his voice softer now, almost contemplative. Colbert sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I think you're wrong about a lot of things. I think you're out of touch with what regular people go through today." "And you're in touch?" Eastwood raised an eyebrow. "Living in your Manhattan bubble, making millions to tell jokes?" "At least I acknowledge my privilege," Colbert countered. "At least I fight for those who don't have what I have." "You think I don't?" Eastwood shook his head slowly. "You know nothing about my charitable work, the foundations I support, the people I've helped personally. Because it doesn't fit your narrative about me." For the first time that evening, Colbert felt a flicker of doubt. What did he really know about Clint Eastwood beyond his public persona and political affiliations? "Why did you really come after me tonight?" Eastwood asked. "The truth, not the rehearsed political talking points." Colbert considered deflecting but found himself too exhausted for more conflict. "You remind me of my father," he admitted, surprising, even himself with the confession. "Stubborn, set in his ways, convinced he has all the answers. We fought about politics for years before he died. Never resolved anything." Something shifted in Eastwood's expression, a softening around the eyes, a subtle change that transformed his entire demeanor. "My father and I rarely saw eye to eye either," he said. "He thought movies were a waste of time, wanted me to get a real job. Went to his grave never really understanding my choices." A moment of unexpected connection hung between them. Two men from different generations and opposing political viewpoints, finding common ground in the complicated relationships with their fathers. "Doesn't mean I'm going to start voting for your candidates," Eastwood added with the ghost of a smile. "Wouldn't expect you to," Colbert replied, a reluctant smile of his own forming. "But maybe I was out of line tonight." "Maybe we both were," Eastwood conceded. The door opened abruptly, and General Harris reappeared. "Time's up. Have you figured out how you're going to fix this mess?" Colbert and Eastwood exchanged looks. Something unspoken passed between them. Not friendship, certainly not agreement, but perhaps a grudging mutual respect. "I think we have," Colbert said, standing up. "Or at least, we've made a start." As they followed General Harris back toward the ballroom, Eastwood suddenly stopped. "You know they're all going to be watching us, waiting for round two." "Then let's give them something unexpected," Colbert suggested. "Though I warn you, it might hurt your tough guy image." Eastwood's famous squint returned, but this time with a hint of amusement. "Try me, funny man." They emerged from the hallway back into the glittering ballroom. As predicted, all eyes immediately turned to them, conversations halting mid-sentence, as the crowd anticipated another explosive confrontation. Instead, they saw Colbert extend his hand to Eastwood. After a deliberate pause that had the room holding its collective breath, Eastwood took it. The handshake wasn't warm, but it was firm and genuine. But what happened next caught everyone by surprise. Colbert leaned in close to Eastwood, speaking just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "I'm going to make this right. Follow my lead." Without waiting for a response, Colbert strode purposefully toward the stage. The band, which had been playing background jazz, abruptly stopped as he approached. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Was he going to make another scene? Colbert took the microphone from its stand and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I owe you all an apology," he began, his voice steady. "Especially our veterans and active service members present tonight. My behavior earlier was inexcusable. I let personal politics overshadow the real purpose of this evening, honoring and supporting those who've sacrificed for our country." The room remained silent, hundreds of eyes watching him skeptically. "I'd like to invite Mr. Clint Eastwood to join me up here," Colbert continued, extending his arm toward where Eastwood stood. Eastwood hesitated, suspicion evident in his stance. General Harris gave him a subtle nod. And slowly, deliberately, Eastwood made his way to the stage. His movements were measured, cautious, like a gunslinger approaching an unpredictable adversary. When Eastwood reached the stage, Colbert offered him the microphone. Another tense moment passed before Eastwood accepted it. "I've been in this business a long time," Eastwood began, his iconic voice filling the room. "Seen a lot of performances. What you all witnessed earlier wasn't acting. It was two grown men forgetting what really matters." He paused, scanning the audience. "My father used to say that a man's character isn't defined by never making mistakes, but by how he handles them afterward." Colbert nodded in agreement, surprising himself with how genuine the gesture felt. "Mr. Colbert and I don't see eye to eye on many things," Eastwood continued. "Probably never will. But there's one thing we do agree on. The men and women in this room who wore the uniform deserve better than the sideshow we gave them." Colbert stepped forward, and Eastwood handed him back the microphone. "Which is why," Colbert announced, I'm personally matching whatever amount is raised tonight. Dollar for dollar." Applause erupted, hesitant at first, then growing stronger. Eastwood's eyebrows rose slightly. This wasn't part of any discussion they'd had. "And," Colbert added, "Mr. Eastwood has generously offered to auction off a private dinner with himself, where the highest bidder can discuss anything from his films to his political views, even argue with him if they want." He glanced sideways at Eastwood with a mischievous grin. "Though I wouldn't recommend it. The man doesn't back down easily." Eastwood's expression was priceless, somewhere between shock and grudging admiration for Colbert's audacity. But to everyone's surprise, including Colbert's, Eastwood nodded his agreement. "Starting bid is $10,000, Eastwood growled into the microphone. "20,000, someone shouted from the back. 30, called another voice. The impromptu auction took on a life of its own. As the bids climbed higher, the earlier tension in the room transformed into excitement. 50,000, 75,000. When the final bid reached $120,000, the room erupted in cheers. Colbert and Eastwood stood side by side on the stage, an unlikely pair joined in a moment of unexpected unity. The winning bidder, a tech mogul known for his philanthropy, approached the stage. "I'm actually bidding on behalf of a veterans group," he announced. "I want a group of disabled vets to have that dinner with Mr. Eastwood." Eastwood's typically stoic expression softened visibly. "I'd be honored," he said. As the formal proceedings resumed, Colbert and Eastwood retreated to a quiet corner of the ballroom. Servers circulated with champagne, and the atmosphere had transformed from tense to celebratory. "That was quite a performance," Eastwood commented, accepting a glass from a passing tray. "Especially the part where you volunteered me for dinner, with strangers." "Consider it payback for earlier," Colbert replied with a smirk. "Besides, I'm the one who has to write a check for—" He glanced at the fundraising tally being displayed on a large screen. "Over $2 million. "Your network can afford it," Eastwood said dryly. "My network isn't paying for it." "I am," Colbert clarified. "This one's on me." Eastwood studied him carefully. "You're full of surprises, Colbert." "As are you," Colbert admitted. "Though I still think you're wrong about almost everything." "The feeling's mutual," Eastwood replied, but there was no bite to his words. Their conversation was interrupted by Senator Wilson, who approached with a broad smile. "Gentlemen, I don't know what General Harris said to you in that room, but it worked. Tonight's fundraising has already doubled last year's total." "Happy to help," Colbert said, his earlier belligerence replaced with genuine satisfaction. "There's a small group of veterans who'd like to meet you both," Wilson continued. "If you're willing?" Eastwood nodded immediately. Colbert hesitated for just a moment before agreeing. They followed Wilson to a table near the back of the ballroom where 5 men and women in various stages of recovery from combat injuries waited. One young man in a wheelchair extended his hand first. "Sergeant James Cooper," he introduced himself. "I just wanted to say, that was something else. What you two did up there." Colbert felt a wave of shame wash over him as he shook the young man's hand. This was who he should have been thinking about all along, not his petty grievances with Eastwood. "The auction was Mr. Colbert's idea," Eastwood said, surprising Colbert with the credit. "And the matching donation was completely unexpected," Wilson added. "It's going to make a real difference." A woman with a prosthetic arm spoke up. "My unit watched your show every night when we were deployed, Mr. Colbert. Laughter was sometimes the only thing that got us through." "And your films, Mr. Eastwood," added another veteran. "Gran Torino was playing in the mess hall the night before my last mission. Watched it 3 times back to back." As they continued talking with the veterans, something shifted between Colbert and Eastwood. The hostility that had defined their earlier interactions was replaced by something more complex. Not quite friendship, but a grudging respect born from witnessing each other's better nature. Later, as the evening wound down, Colbert found himself standing near the exit with Eastwood. "My car's waiting," Eastwood said. "Need a ride anywhere?" Colbert considered the offer. "Actually, I could use a drink. A real one, not whatever they're serving here." "I know a place," Eastwood replied. "If you can handle whiskey that doesn't come with a fancy name and an umbrella." "Lead the way, Dirty Harry," Colbert said with a genuine smile. Their unlikely detente continued at a small, dimly lit bar several blocks from the hotel. It was the kind of establishment that valued privacy. No phones allowed, no photographs, just good liquor and discretion. They sat in a corner booth, 2 tumblers of amber liquid between them. "You know," Eastwood said after his first sip, "you're not at all what I expected." "I could say the same about you," Colbert admitted, "though I still think that speech you gave at the 2012 convention was bizarre." "It wasn't my finest moment," Eastwood conceded with a dry chuckle. "But you try saying no to a presidential candidate who calls you personally." "Actually, I probably would say no," Colbert replied. "Exactly my point," Eastwood said. "We're different. Always will be." They lapsed into silence, but it was no longer hostile. Outside the bar's windows, paparazzi had gathered, their cameras at the ready. Someone had tipped them off. Tomorrow the headlines would be everywhere, but not the headlines either man had feared earlier. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Colbert's Manhattan apartment as he scrolled through the media coverage on his tablet. His head throbbed slightly from last night's whiskey, but it was nothing compared to the anxiety churning in his stomach as he assessed the damage to his career. The headlines were surprisingly positive, focusing on their eventual reconciliation and the impressive fundraising results, rather than just the initial confrontation. Media outlets were framing it as a heartwarming story about political opposites, coming together for a good cause. Several entertainment sites highlighted how they'd gone from heated argument to productive collaboration. Of course, many also mentioned his profane outburst toward Eastwood, which made him wince, but overall, the coverage was far better than he'd feared. His phone had been ringing constantly since dawn. His producer, network executives, his publicist. He'd ignored them all, needing time to process the previous night's events. His doorbell rang. Colbert frowned, not expecting visitors, especially this early. Through the peephole, he saw a young courier holding a small package. "Delivery for Stephen Colbert," the courier announced when he opened the door. Colbert signed for the package and brought it inside. No return address. He tore open the brown paper wrapping to find a small wooden box. Inside lay an antique pocket watch and a handwritten note on thick cardstock. "This belonged to my father. He gave it to me when I directed my first film. Said it was to remind me that time is the only truly limited resource we have. Thought you might appreciate it, even if you don't appreciate my politics." C.E. Colbert held the watch carefully, noting the fine craftsmanship and the subtle wear of decades of use. It was an unexpectedly personal gesture from a man he'd spent years dismissing as a political caricature. His phone rang again. This time, he answered. "Stephen, finally," his producer exclaimed. "Have you seen the numbers? Last night's live stream of the Gala broke all our previous records, and the social media engagement is through the roof." "That's good?" Colbert ventured, still cradling the pocket watch. "Good? It's phenomenal. The network wants you and Eastwood to appear together on the show next week. They're calling it a cultural moment, bridging the political divide, setting an example for the country. What do you think?" Colbert hesitated. The idea of Eastwood on his show would have seemed absurd just 24 hours ago. Now, it felt like a natural next step. "Let me make a call first," he said. "I'll get back to you." After hanging up, he searched through his contacts until he found the number General Harris had shared with him last night, Eastwood's direct line. He took a deep breath and dialed. "Eastwood," the familiar gravelly voice answered on the second ring. "It's Colbert. I got your gift." A pause. "And?" It's meaningful. Thank you. Colbert hesitated. The network wants us on my show next week, together. The silence that followed lasted long enough that Colbert wondered if the connection had been lost. You sure you want me on your turf? Eastwood finally asked. Your audience isn't exactly my fan club. That's kind of the point, Colbert replied. After last night, maybe we all need to get better at listening to people we disagree with. Another pause, shorter this time. What did you have in mind? Honest conversation. No ambushes, no gotcha questions. Just two guys with different views talking about why we believe what we believe. Your producers will go for that? No viral clips of us at each other's throats? I'll make it a condition of the appearance, Colbert promised. This isn't about ratings. It's about something more important. Never thought I'd hear a television host say anything was more important than ratings, Eastwood remarked dryly. I'm full of surprises, Colbert said, echoing Eastwood's words from the previous night. So what do you say? Tuesday at 4:30 for pre-show preparation? I'll be there, Eastwood agreed. And Colbert? Bring your A-game. I'm not holding back just because we shared a whiskey. Wouldn't dream of it, Mr. Eastwood. 6 days later, Colbert stood backstage at the Ed Sullivan Theater, watching the audience file in. They were an energetic crowd, buzzing with anticipation. Word of Eastwood's appearance had sparked intense interest, with ticket requests far exceeding capacity. 5 minutes, Stephen, a production assistant called out. Colbert straightened his tie and rolled his shoulders to release tension. In his pocket, he carried Eastwood's father's watch, a reminder of the unexpected connection they'd formed. Nervous? A voice behind him asked. He turned to find Eastwood, looking surprisingly comfortable in the chaotic backstage environment. At 94, he still carried himself with the straight-backed confidence that had defined his screen presence for decades. Not nervous, Colbert replied. Just aware of the responsibility. A lot of people will be watching tonight. Eastwood nodded in understanding. During my second film as director, I was so paralyzed by the pressure that I couldn't call action on the first day. Just stood there, frozen. You? Frozen? Colbert couldn't hide his surprise. Everyone freezes sometimes, Eastwood said simply. The trick is to thaw quickly. A production assistant appeared. Mr. Eastwood, we need you in the green room until your introduction. As Eastwood turned to follow, Colbert called after him. For what it's worth, I'm glad you didn't punch me at the gala. Would have made for a very different headline. Eastwood's signature half-smile appeared. Night's still young, Colbert. The show began with thunderous applause. Colbert's monologue touched briefly on the now famous confrontation, poking fun at himself while respecting the serious purpose of the veterans' event. When it came time to introduce Eastwood, the audience erupted. The interview started awkwardly, both men initially falling back on practiced public personas. But about 5 minutes in, something shifted. Colbert mentioned Eastwood's father's watch, now sitting in his pocket. The conversation deepened, moving from political talking points to personal stories. They discussed their fathers, their earliest memories of understanding politics, the moments that shaped their worldviews. They disagreed, frequently and fundamentally, but without the hostility that had marked their first encounter. Each listened when the other spoke. Each acknowledged valid points made by his counterpart. The audience, expecting fireworks, instead witnessed something rarer, genuine dialogue across the political divide. You know, Eastwood said during a commercial break, just between the two of them, my father would have liked you. He enjoyed a good argument. High praise, Colbert replied with a smile. My father would have hated that I'm sitting here having a civil conversation with you. He was even more stubborn than I am. Hard to imagine, Eastwood quipped. When the show wrapped, the applause was deafening. Social media exploded immediately, clips from the interview spreading across platforms with comments expressing surprise and, in many cases, grudging respect for both men's willingness to engage thoughtfully. Later that evening, they found themselves once again in a quiet bar, away from cameras and crowds. "This arrived for you," Colbert said, sliding a small package across the table. "Thought you might want it right away." Eastwood opened it to find a check for over $4 million, the final tally from the Veterans fundraiser, including Colbert's matching donation. "The charity's director wanted to deliver it personally, but I told her I'd see you first," Colbert explained. Eastwood carefully folded the check and placed it in his jacket pocket. $4 million will build a lot of wheelchair ramps and cover a lot of therapy sessions." "It's a start," Colbert agreed. They sat in companionable silence, for a moment, sipping their drinks. "So," Eastwood finally said, "same time next year? Maybe without the public shouting match to kick things off?" "I don't know," Colbert replied with a grin. "The shouting seemed to work pretty well for fundraising." "True," Eastwood conceded. "But next time, let's rehearse it first. Your timing was way off." "Are you critiquing my performance, Mr. Director?" "If the shoe fits." They both laughed, an unexpected sound that drew curious glances from nearby patrons. "To unlikely partnerships," Colbert said, raising his glass. "And to fathers who wouldn't understand them," Eastwood added, clinking his glass against Colbert's. Outside, the city continued its relentless pace. Inside, two men who had begun as bitter adversaries discovered that respect didn't require agreement, and that sometimes the most important conversations happened across the widest divides. The headlines the next morning would tell a new story, not of conflict, but of connection. And in a country increasingly defined by its divisions, that was a story worth telling.